Well, welcome to the webinar on global warming metrics in livestock farming systems, an interpretation and a policy advice. This webinar is organized by CIAM Zaragoza, which is an acronym for the International Center of Advanced Mediterranean Agronomic Studies. The abbreviation is in French because at the time that we were created in 1962, French was the leading language of the European Union. Yeah, still it is, but not that much. And well, we are an intergovernmental organization of 13 countries, Mediterranean countries. You will see in the picture there the member countries. And what we do is cooperation, transfer knowledge in the Mediterranean region by activities like webinars, like hot topic trainings, like participating in projects. So the idea is that we promote the cooperation in the Mediterranean region. We have 4 institutes, one in Montpellier, one in Bari, Italy, one in Cania in Crete, and the one in Zaragoza, in which I work, Zaragoza, Spain, is the only one of these 4 institutes who has activities in relation with livestock production. So, and as I told you, we organize activities, educational activities, training, specifically in hot topics like what we are doing today. And this activity, this webinar, is also part of the Re-Livestock project, which is an Horizon Europe project. And the objective is to understand and mobilize adoption of innovative practice applied across scales to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in livestock farming systems and to increase the capacity of dealing with these climate change impacts in, well, basically resilience in other topics. So we have a little bit of pessimistic point of view in terms that maybe we are not going to get it in terms of global warming. So we are preparing about it. This project is focused on cattle and swine. We are 37 partners from all Europe, and this webinar is part of the dissemination activities of this project. So we will have, this is the first one. We're in the second half of the project. So from now on, you will begin to, is now when we begin to produce results. So now we're going to actively produce dissemination material that you might be interested on it. So there is the webpage. Follow us in social networks too to know when is our next dissemination activity. And without further ado, well, let's go with the webinar. I will stop sharing my screen. And we are 99 people so far. That's good. And well, about the structure of this webinar. We will have first a keynote lecture that will last about 40 minutes, Michelle? 40 minutes, kind of. About global, well, as you see, the title of the webinar is Global Warming Metrics, Interpretation and Policy Advice. So the lecture is going to be mostly focused on meaning, interpretation, and what we can get from these metrics. And later, the second part is going to be a roundtable section from all the other panelists, and we will discuss a little bit more on the policy side. I saw the Michelle presentation. She has a lot of questions that we will begin with the discussion with these questions. But if there is time, we will open the discussion for questions to the attendants to this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Michelle Kane. Michelle Kane is a senior lecturer on Cranfield University. Her research focuses on developing methods, models, and metrics to help understand the effect that changing greenhouse gas emission has on global warming level in line with the Paris Agreement temperature limit. Current project focus on how much of a role methane and nitrous oxide can play in the mitigation in agriculture, including trade-off and life cycle emission. And also she led the UN FAO Technical Advisory Group on Methane which produced the report on methane emission in livestock and rice systems, and was published in 2023. So, Michelle, whenever you want to begin, please share
Thank you
your
so much.
screen and
Yeah. Let's see if this works. Can you see my screen okay?
yes, we can see it.
Yeah, great. Okay, first hurdle. Thanks so much, Andres, for introducing me and inviting me to give this seminar. This is the title I was given is Global Warming Metrics in Livestock Systems, Interpretations and Policy Advice. I think it's I'll try and stick to this area, but there will be kind of quite a bit of I guess contextualizing or background information, which hopefully is useful for then understanding the livestock systems, which is where you all have the the more detailed knowledge than I do. So I'll cover metrics, context and basics, why metrics matter, like why do we care about these things, and then give some examples and insights, and then leading into questions that we'll discuss as a panel. So to start with, greenhouse gases. We've probably all seen data presented as CO2 equivalent emissions, CO2e. It implies that there's something, it's called CO2 equivalent, so CO2 is the main event there, but it's not just CO2. As we all know from agricultural systems, there's also methane and nitrous oxide. So I just wanted to start with that as a concept, and to show this figure this is from the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report, the Working Group 1 of the 6th Assessment Report. And I really like this figure because it shows the impact on levels of global warming from these different components of the climate system. So the first bar is showing CO2. I don't know if you can actually, can someone tell me, can you see my mouse, or do I need to click on a pointer? We need to click on the pointer.
We can see your mouse.
Oh, you can see it anyway. I'll just use that then. So CO2, it has the largest contribution to global warming. It's got the biggest bar here. But we also have methane as the next biggest. So this methane contribution is about 0.5 degree centigrade. And then nitrous oxide is a lot smaller, but it's still there in the system. So we can see that these different gases do contribute substantially to global warming, especially methane. But what's not shown in this diagram is the persistence of those effects. So methane has a lot shorter lifetime in the atmosphere than does carbon dioxide. So the lifetime is roughly around a decade, around 10 years. And so that means if you emit methane now, it starts to decay through chemical reactions on a time scale of around 10 years. So in 10 years' time, around half of the methane that I might emit today will have decayed through chemical reactions. And so that means that there's not such a persistent effect on the climate system for methane. Nitrous oxide has a lifetime of around 100 plus years. So it's somewhere in between. So what does that mean in terms of this diagram? It means if we take the case where we stopped all methane emissions today, completely stopped all our anthropogenic methane emissions, this 0.5 degree of global warming that we've already caused would roughly halve in about 20 or 30 years' time. So we can see that it's reversible because of that short lifetime. The methane we emitted in the past will start to be destroyed and the temperature will go down. For CO2, that's not the case. The CO2 remains in the atmosphere, in the climate system, so that bar for CO2 would remain the same over that period. And so just to look at this another way, how is this happening? I've got a couple of diagrams about short-lived and long-lived greenhouse gases. So CO2 is a long-lived greenhouse gas. And that means that when we emit CO2, so the first diagram here is emissions. We have the same emissions every year in this diagram. What happens to that in the atmosphere? Well, it stays in the atmosphere. So the concentrations in the atmosphere, which is the right-hand panel, the concentration builds up. So every year we add a new block of CO2 to the atmosphere. And so you can see that the overall concentration each year increases. And that will continue to be the case unless we get CO2 emissions to zero or net zero. Okay, that's because of this long lifetime of CO2. Because of methane's shorter lifetime, if our emissions of methane were stable over time, so for a long period we've just had the same emissions of methane, which is not the case in real life at the moment. But if we had the same emissions over time, actually the emissions would be balanced by the chemical reactions in the atmosphere, and you'd have a dynamic equilibrium. So you would have the same amount of emissions, but the same chemical destruction, and actually the concentration in the atmosphere would remain the same over time. So this is how we can see that there's a difference between short-lived and long-lived gases in terms of how much they accumulate in the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide has a lifetime of over a century, so it is somewhere in between methane and CO2 in terms of lifetime. So moving on to how this affects levels of climate change or global warming or temperature in the atmosphere. I'm going to show three examples that show some idealized cases of emissions over time. So this first one, the top panel here, is showing emissions over time of CO2 and methane, just an idealized example. And in this case, our emissions are rising year on year. So every year the emissions rise. And because we're increasing the amount that we're adding to the atmosphere each year, for both methane and CO2, we actually get an increase in temperature. Okay, because we're adding more and more methane each year, the amount of methane remaining in the atmosphere is increasing. So the level of warming from methane is also increasing. And so looking at some data so this is data from Our World in Data, looking for an example, methane globally is increasing. So methane emissions and the concentrations in the atmosphere is currently increasing. So that's the situation we are in globally. In this example, we have constant emissions of CO2 and methane. And what happens in the atmosphere there is that the methane emissions, as we saw in the block diagram, the methane concentrations in the atmosphere are not increasing because we have this stable amount of emission balanced by the sink, the chemical sink. And so this amount of warming from this stable emission of methane is roughly constant. It's almost constant. It is slightly increasing. That is because the climate system has different timescales of behavior. There is a bit of a time lag, so it's still responding, and it will continue to respond for decades and longer to past changes in methane in the atmosphere. So that slight increase is due to this slower response time of the deep oceans, largely. And so that's very different to the CO2 case, where this stable emission of CO2, and as in the block diagram, there's more and more CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere, so the level of warming from CO2 is increasing. If we look for an example of this out in the data, New Zealand has roughly stable methane emissions. And so to look at the final example, it's where we have falling emissions, declining emissions. And this is where it gets a bit different again. For CO2, decreasing CO2 emissions still causes additional warming, because if we remember back to the block diagram, every single emission accumulates. And so until the CO2 gets to zero emissions, we get an increase in the temperature. And then it flatlines, it stabilizes, it plateaus once we get to zero CO2 emissions. For methane, on the other hand, because of this shorter lifetime, decreasing methane emissions means that actually the amount of methane remaining in the atmosphere, it's essentially not being replenished the past levels. So we end up having the combination of less emissions, plus all the chemical reactions going on anyway. So the amount of methane remaining in the atmosphere is going down. So we actually have a declining level of global warming from those methane emissions. And so if we look to an example in the emissions data for this, the European Union has been decreasing its methane emissions over time. So this is just a figure with all the examples. There's a link at the bottom to a little note which explains all of this in a bit more detail. But that's the overarching picture for how different short-lived and long-lived gases behave in the atmosphere. But why does this matter for metrics? So why did I need to tell you all of that? So I'm going to go on to looking at why this actually does make a difference to when we use different greenhouse gas metrics. So what do we use metrics for? A greenhouse gas emission metric, so that's what I mean by metrics specifically, can be used to compare different greenhouse gases. And essentially, we usually do this by using a metric to a CO2 equivalent unit. So it's a bit like an exchange rate, converting from pounds to euros or something like this. But when it comes to greenhouse gas emission metrics, it's not as simple as simply converting from pounds to euros, where there is one exchange rate that you can look up. It's based on the metric that you choose, and there's a number of different metrics out there. So in this simple example, I've just shown that if you have a ton of methane emissions, that would be equivalent to 80 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions if you use GWP 20. I'll go on to what GWP is in a second. If you use a GWP 100, it's 27. And if it's GTP 100, it's 5. So you see these are all very different numbers because they're all based on different quantities, which I'll come on to next. So the standard metric that we tend to use is GWP 100, which is global warming potential over 100 years. And this particular metric, so if you want to know what it's exactly capturing, the definition of it is that it's capturing the additional energy in the climate system over a 100-year period following an emission of 1 kilo of gas, say methane, relative to the same quantity from 1 kilo of CO2. So it's normalized to 1. So the value of GWP 100 for CO2 would be 1 by definition. So it's standardized to CO2. And this can be a useful way to try and bring different gases onto the same scale, but it really depends on what your question is, what you're trying to compare. Because it doesn't directly compare the impact on temperature for short-lived gases, it actually does quite a good job for long-lived gases, but because of this lifetime difference, it doesn't really link to temperature, which I will go on to show you. So if you do care about temperature specifically, it's not a great metric to do that. And so other metrics have been developed over the years and decades. So for example, global temperature change potential, which I included at the bottom, GTP, that one does specifically look at temperature at a particular time. And also GWP star, which I'll come on to talk about, also does look at temperature. So to kind of summarize this whole issue, I use an analogy to fruit. So I think greenhouse gas metrics are a bit like fruit. Bear with me. We have all these lovely different picture of lovely different fruit here, but they all look very, very different. How do we compare them to one another? It really depends on your question. So, we have many tools or metrics we could use. We could use a ruler to measure the height. We could use scales to measure the weight. We could even use a colorimeter to measure the color. Each of these things accurately measures a particular quantity for the different fruit, but they all give us a different answer. They're accurate but different, and that's the same as the different greenhouse gas metrics. they actually are all based on the same science, the same models. In fact, they're pretty much all based on the same equations fundamentally, but they do all have different quantities because we're looking at different things or different timescales. So depending on what your question is for the fruit, does it fit in my lunchbox? Which is heaviest? Which will get squished the most? I don't know how you'd measure that. But there's, you might use a different tool, different metric, depending on what your question was. And so really my bottom line, I think, is, only use a metric if you need to, and use one that will help you in your quest, whatever it is you're looking for, if you do use one. This is a figure that is from the FAO report that I was mentioned before, which is about methane emissions, sources, quantification, mitigation, and metrics. So I'll refer to this a few times, and I'll just say now that if you want more details, I'm not going to go into lots of technical details here, but you can go to that report if you want to find out a bit more about metrics. This figure is basically summarizing that we might start with emissions, and this is how the emissions actually affect the climate system. They affect the concentrations, then it affects the radiative forcing. There are different measures of climate change like temperature, atmospheric temperature, that are captured in climate change, but there's also other impacts, and metrics may be representing any one of these different things or any components of it: sea level rise, surface temperature, etc. So you can see that metrics may capture a multitude of different things. And so I just want to focus on one of those things, which is temperature or temperature change, climate change, and show that there's a difference between methane and CO2 in the atmosphere, and how those emissions are not completely equivalent in every way. So I think this example should hopefully illustrate my points quite clearly. It's from a paper by Lynch et al. In 2021. And it's a very simple example. So we have an idealized example. It could be a country, it could be a sector, totally fictional. And we have emissions. So this is the emissions profile. 0 emissions before 1950. The emissions increase to a peak, they plateau, then they decrease, and then they reach, oops, spoiler alert, they reach 0 at 2050. So we have this emissions profile, but you'll notice it says it's CO2 equivalent emissions. These CO2 equivalent emissions have been defined using GWP 100, but we don't know which gas they are. So we're going to try and work out what the implications are if these emissions were completely CO2, or if they were completely methane, or if there's a mixture of CO2 and methane. What would happen? So what would this country's contribution to global warming be if these emissions were CO2 or if they were methane? And so that's what we've done. We've modeled those emissions in a climate model and taken a look at how much warming is generated by those emissions. And what you can see is, depending on how much methane or CO2 is in the mix, we get different levels of warming over time. And so if we start with the CO2, that's the blue line, the heavy blue line. CO2 emissions, the amount of warming from the CO2 emissions increases over time to a peak level. The peak in warming is when we reach net zero, or in this case, reach 0. So the shaded area is the same time span in both diagrams. And so we have to wait till we get to 0 emissions of CO2 to be sure we're at the peak of warming. That's a contrast to methane in the yellow, where actually the peak is a lot higher. So we actually get much more warming in the shorter term from these methane emissions as they're ramping up. And then it peaks at the time when we're in the plateau of the emissions. And as you start to, just after the plateau in emissions, when we start to decrease the methane emissions, the temperature follows. So the amount of warming from the methane starts to go down. It follows the trend of the emissions. So that tells us that the warming from methane emissions is largely reversible, not entirely reversible, but it is largely reversible. And so that's a key difference. I would say that the key differences here are in the shorter term, methane is causing more warming than CO2. And then in the longer term, it's causing a lot less warming. So this is why we've been working on warming equivalent methods. I'll call them warming equivalent methods, because that captures the essence of what we're trying to get at here. And there's multiple different ways of doing it. So we could use a simple climate model like we did in the last slide. We could use metrics like GWP star, or other metrics that are also trying to achieve the same thing. So combined global temperature change potential is another metric that does this in a slightly different way. And so sometimes these are called step pulse metrics, just as a terminology note. So these warming equivalent methods are sometimes called step pulse metrics. And that's because they equate a step change increase in methane emission with a one-off pulse emission of CO2. And now that's probably quite, maybe a little bit confusing now. So I haven't got lots of slides to go into why that is, but it is explained in that FAO report. So the only thing I will say about these types of methods, they do require slightly more thought and understanding than GWP 100 to apply. But I would say that's a good thing, because without the understanding, we can apply metrics really poorly. And this way, we can use GWP 100 or any metric really badly if we're not understanding what we're doing. Okay, so this is an example of the step pulse nature of these metrics. Sorry, I realise there's quite a lot of information just in one go here, but hopefully it will make sense when I go through it. So this is a panel from a figure from a paper by Lynch et al. Again, different paper. And in this example, if you just look at the top panel to start with, this is showing an example of methane emissions. So we just introduce a new methane emission and it is stable. So this is a step change in methane emissions. We start off with no emissions. We have a step change up to 4 megatons per year. And then we convert those methane emissions to CO2 equivalent using GWP star or GWP 100 in the next panel. And so this is what it looks like. It's a step pulse metric, because we have a step change in methane emissions actually looks like a one-off pulse, large pulse of CO2 emissions, followed by this smaller step change in the CO2 emissions. Why do we do that? Well, we actually do that ultimately because that's how the different gases affect the temperature. Because if we put those emissions into the model, we model the amount of warming we get, for the GWP star emissions, we get this blue line, which mimics the brown dashed line, which is what happens when we place the methane emissions themselves into the model. So ultimately, this formulation of GWP star does approximate the warming that we get from the CO2 and methane pretty well. GWP 100 is shown in the red. It doesn't do a good job. Essentially, it's because it's averaging over the whole 100 years. It really kind of is, it underestimates the warming in the short term and overestimates it in the long term. Okay. And so I think I'll go quite quickly through the next few slides because they're just multiple examples of the same kind of panel. So they're from the same paper, and there's various different examples of different emission scenarios. So in the previous one, we were introducing a new methane emission. In this one, we have sustained emissions. So this is like, what if we continue on, and just have the same emissions over time indefinitely? And so we've got the same form of the graphs. We have sustained emissions of methane. We convert them to CO2 equivalent using GWP 100 and GWP star. And then we put those into the model to model the amount of warming that we get. And GWP star is doing a good job of approximating the amount of warming that we get in the lower panel. And you can see here that it's GWP 100 is overestimating. If you were to kind of just go look at these GWP 100 based emissions, it's over-representing the amount of warming we actually get if we put that into a model. If we reduce emissions, methane emissions over time, we end up getting a negative value for GWP star, which can seem rather strange. How can an emission be negative? And the reason is that when we model the amount of warming we get from this declining methane emission scenario, temperature starts to go down because we're reducing the emissions that quickly. There's actually less methane left in the atmosphere. So GWP star is designed to mimic this, and so we're effectively capturing the fact that temperature's going down. And if you were to use, if you only had CO2, if you were only able to add or take away CO2 to the atmosphere, the only way to bring temperature down would be to remove it from the atmosphere, hence a negative emission. So that's what's going on there. And you can see from GWP 100 is always going to be positive as an emission. So it's always going to be pushing temperatures up if you take that at face value. There's a special case if we try and work out what it takes to keep global warming at a stable level. That works out to be a decrease in methane emissions of 0.3% per year, or 3% a decade. And so we get stable temperatures if we do that. And then this panel just shows two examples of increasing emissions, and I'll just focus on the second one, where we have exponentially increasing emissions, because here our GWP emissions values are higher than the GWP 100 ones. And so that's showing that in this particular case, GWP 100's underestimating how much warming you'd get. A bit like the first part of the graph I showed that in the fictional idealized scenario. So we can see that it goes both ways. You can either underestimate or overestimate the warming using GWP 100. Okay, so I appreciate that was a whistle-stop tour of some very technical stuff without actually going through all the technicalities behind it. So I'm going to try and bring it to a bit more of a practical level and try and give you some insights that I've had from using warming equivalents in different examples and different case studies. The first one is about estimating the warming effect of any particular policy or action. And the second one is thinking about warming equivalent exchanges. So this one really just follows on from what I just showed you. These are the figures that I just showed, a couple of them. And it's really the take home that if you want to think about a new policy, or just a policy in fact, and you want to think about how it affects levels of global warming, you could use GWP star or another warming equivalent method to try and to approximate that. And so you can see that if you maintain, reducing methane emissions by 3% per decade maintains at current levels of contribution to warming. But if you reduce methane faster than that, you'll start to reduce levels of global warming. That means getting a peak and decline in methane-induced warming. So we can see that's quite a simple message to take home, I think. And so what this also enables you to do is think about different gases and where there may be trade-offs in contributions to global warming, because it may be that a particular policy or action, it increases CO2 emissions, or it increases nitrous oxide emissions at the same time as reducing methane emissions. And so you might be interested in figuring out what's the net change in temperature. Does that benefit from reducing methane emissions? Is that greater than the increases in CO2 or nitrous oxide emissions? So using a warming equivalent method, you could look into that. And that, you could use a full more complex models, or you may be able to just use a metric like GWP star. And the other thing that you can do, which I think is interesting, is looking at change over time, because as we saw with the modeling of the fictional scenario, the effects are different over time. So methane has a short, very intense warming period, but then it is quite reversible. So it might be that some policies maybe really look better at a shorter timescale compared to a longer timescale. And so that could be a very interesting thing to look at. Ultimately, I think having an estimate of avoided warming would allow for incentivizing avoided warming, which presumably is what we all want in terms of the Paris Agreement headline goal. So I'm going to give another example now, which this is actually from the FAO report. It's showing benefits of using a feed additive in a control farm. So I'll just explain how we've got to these graphs. We have a control farm, which is a dairy farm, and we have emissions associated with that farm. And then we've also worked out what the emissions would be on that farm if you used a feed additive for the dairy cows. So the experiment is adding a feed additive to reduce methane emissions in 2020 onwards. And so we've looked in the first panel, this is the difference in CO2 equivalent emissions, calculated using various different metrics. And so the GWP 100 is shown in red or pinkish red. So we can see when we introduce the feed additive in 2020, emissions do reduce. So the benefits for CO2, of methane reductions, based on all the metrics, in fact, are greater than any increases in CO2 in producing this feed additive. So those are the emissions over time. The GWP star has a kind of a step, and that's because it's a step pulse metric. So we have an initial larger factor for the first 20 years after you introduce the additive, and then a smaller difference in the longer term. So then we've taken the emissions and put them into a climate model. And so when we put the methane, nitrous oxide and CO2 emissions into the model, we get the black line on the left, so it's underneath. So what really happens? What's the difference? What benefit do we have? What warming do we avoid as a result of using this feed additive? That's the black line. And then if you put the CO2 emissions from calculated by using all these different metrics into the model, we get the other coloured lines. And so what we can see there is that in the first sort of 20 or so years, the green line is quite well aligned with the black line. And so the green line is GWP 20. And so in this example, we're realizing that in the short term, the reduction in methane emissions has a real strong benefit, and that's captured well by GWP 20 here. In the longer term, though, the benefit from introducing the feed additive starts to taper off, and GWP 20 can't capture that, so that's beyond the time horizon that it's really focusing on. GWP star has, because it has this two terms, it does try and capture this change in the change in the gradient of this line. So it does, it tries to approximate this curve. I would say that this climate model is ACC2. It's a different climate model to what was used to develop GWP star and the other metrics. So it's no surprise really that there's some differences, and it's not such a good approximation. But it does still try and capture those main features. So this is one way that we can start to use these warming equivalent methods to try and understand when am I going to get a benefit from doing this intervention. Another example, this was a paper out about a year ago, and it's looking globally, so it's not looking at agricultural livestock in particular, but it's looking at scenarios which achieve 1.5 or degree or 2 degree warming limits. So scenarios that achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And effectively, the bottom line of this, they use GWP star to look at this warming equivalence in these scenarios, and they were looking at the carbon budget. So the remaining carbon budget is a concept that says if we want to keep warming below 2 degrees, we've only got this much CO2 we can emit, because that will bring us up to 2 degrees. And this is quite, they've run the numbers on this. It's quite intuitive once you think about it. In those scenarios, there are methane reductions, and if you don't achieve those methane reductions and you keep methane stable at 2020 emissions levels, that would effectively use up the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So if you don't take action on methane, then it makes it much harder to achieve the temperature goals. And in fact, that means there's even less carbon budget remaining. So I think this shows that in all these different scenarios, the assumption is that there's action on all gases, and the more you can, obviously, if you don't reduce methane emissions, then they won't really be valid scenarios anymore. I think this is my final example in this section about how we can use warming equivalent methods. This is from a paper by Clark et al. In 2020. This was looking at the global food system, so not just agriculture, but all elements of the food system. And this was interesting because they looked at 5 different strategies that they've shown in the coloured bars to reduce the impact of the food system. But in each of these on their own, the emissions from the food system still take us beyond the 1.5 degree limit, even when we get rid of all other emissions globally. If we apply all measures to 50%, you still just about reach the 1.5 degree limit. That's the grey bar. But if you apply all the measures completely, it actually led to no further warming. So that's the last bar, which you can barely see. So they've used GWP star here to look at this. And essentially it's saying if you implemented all of that, then we won't be adding further global warming to the system beyond 2020. So that was a really interesting application, I thought, of GWP star. So for the second area, I'm not going to go into lots of detail about this because that would take a whole seminar in itself, I think. But it's to just introduce the concept of warming equivalent exchanges. Really, that might be sort of offsetting or something like this. So effectively, if you have an emission, can you offset it by doing something else? Can you remove some CO2 somewhere in the system? And typically, you might do this offsetting using GWP 100, I would say, because that's the kind of go-to metric. So, and if you look at all the scenarios that reach net zero, this is what they do. They use GWP 100. And I believe in the EU, net zero is defined specifically using GWP 100 as well. So the issue here is that we know from before that GWP 100 isn't based on temperature. So if we offset all our remaining methane emissions with CO2 removals, then it's not like for like in terms of effect on temperature. So I think this sort of raises an interesting and potentially quite confusing question. What does this mean for net zero in agriculture or economy-wide as well? So if you have an emission of methane and you offset it with a removal of CO2, that's different if you did it the other way around. And we can get into lots of different issues around this. So these are just two, one paper, academic paper, that looks at that idea of internationally transferred offsetting, really, in the first one. And then there's also an interesting report from New Zealand, which was looking about forestry offsetting agricultural methane. Obviously, two things that are quite important in New Zealand. And so you get these differences in timescale when it comes to CO2 and methane emissions or removals. So I think I've just about made it in time. Sorry if I went a little bit fast. I'll just summarize with these final thoughts, which are more like questions, which should hopefully bring us into the next section. So thinking about all of these different issues related to metrics and methane, how do we decide what is an acceptable level of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, or it could be from any sector really? And I mean, my personal thoughts are that it shouldn't be metric dependent, because metrics are really just a tool. I think you should be considering what the outcome is, what is the intended outcome, and then can we work out what an acceptable level of greenhouse gas emissions is, given all the, all the different priorities and pressures. And so it would be, I think, inappropriate that the metric was kind of guiding that. I think it should be dependent on outcomes. And related to this really is how governments value emissions reductions, because governments want to incentivize action that's based on what outcomes they want. What's the intended outcome? Is it, what is it? And is the emissions reductions, are they being valued accordingly and appropriately? And so maybe metrics are useful in trying to do that valuation. And then the last point really is building on the idea of offsetting and net zero scenarios that offset methane emissions with GWP 100 based CO2 removals. They give a declining temperature. There are various papers that have shown that. And that kind of raises some questions about what we're trying to do here. What, is that exactly what's wanted, or is it kind of is it the artifact of the metric that's used? So it could be a very interesting conversation and deliberation over this. And because it brings into the fact that different sectors are generating different emissions and providing different removals. So there is an element, I think, of fairness and reward, etc., that could come into this discussion. So I think that's all I've got. I just put in the reference there for the FAO report, which has a lot of detail about all sorts of things to do with livestock and rice systems and metrics. And I think, yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you. Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Michelle, for this nice presentation. I understood a lot of new things with that too. I will ask, well, for people who just arriving, we are now about 120 people. So for people who is just arriving, the structure of this webinar is on two parts. The first part was the presentation from Michelle about, well, metrics and characteristics and how they work and so on. And the second part is going to be a roundtable discussion about well, more policy discussion, policy advice, which is the second part of the title of this webinar. And for that, I would like to ask to the other panel members to turn on the cameras, please. Good. And I will introduce you. Well, I already introduced you, Michelle. She's going to be part of the roundtable discussion. I would like to introduce Dr. Agustín del Prado. He's an Iber-Basque Associate Research Professor at the Basque Center for Climate Change, BC3. His main area of expertise is the development and use of mathematical simulation models to assess the effect of ruminant farming system on climate change, and a study of potential strategies for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Among other duties, he has been an IPCC lead author for the 2019 refinement of the IPCC guidelines from the National Greenhouse Gases Inventories for the agricultural soil, NO2, and the livestock greenhouse gases chapter. So, Agustin, welcome to the panel. And well, here he's also a member of the advisory boards of Re-Livestock project. Thanks for coming, Agustin.
Thank you, Andres.
Next, I would like to introduce you Dr. Catherine Pfeiffer. Catherine leads the environmental modeling within the Food System Department at FIDL, which is the acronym for Research Institute of Organic Agriculture. After earning her PhD at Wageningen, she spent over a decade at ILRI, which is the International Livestock Research Institute, working on sustainable livestock system in the global south. Her current research focuses on the role of livestock in food system with a focus on European organic production. Catherine, welcome. And last but not least, oops, I missed my. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Josef Rudek. Dr. Rudek is a lead senior scientist with the Environmental Defense Fund. He leads the EDF Global Sustainable Livestock science team, as well as providing technical support for EDF work with fostering sustainable agriculture and food supply chains for major consumer products good companies. He has more than 2 decades of experience in working on techniques and technologies to reduce greenhouse gases and nitrogen emissions from agriculture, especially from livestock, manure management, and low carbon rice farming. So, welcome, Joseph, aka Joe, for friends.
Thank you.
Now, reminder for questions. Well, we have a series of questions. I have a series of questions for the panelists. One of them were raised by Michelle. If you have a question, please don't use the chat. Use the Q&A tool, so I can read them. And well, I will try to, when you make the questions, try to be really specific about the slide. Hey, I don't understand that slide. Please, could you repeat it? But try to make it wider. You will have higher chances to pick up I pick up your question if it's more into the policy side, which is the focus on the discussion, and it's not that specific. Okay. So, for what I understood from Michelle's presentation, metric doesn't matter. So we just have to pick up the right one. Okay. And well, there are certain controversy about well, the GWP star and GWP 100, and which should we select as a standard for global warming metrics. And I would like to ask the panelists of this one, do you have any opinion, or do you agree just like Michelle? Do you have an opinion different than Michelle in which the metric doesn't matter? We should focus. Is there any favorite metric that we should decide as a standard? Because, well, so far the standard for global warming metrics, as far as I understand, is the GWP 100. So yeah, should we continue with this metric as a standard, or the metric doesn't matter, as Michelle said? What do you think? Do you have any comment on that? Should I pick up as random? Someone want to break the ice?
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Joey.
So as Michelle noted, it's really critical what the goal is, what your objectives are. And noted that in the next couple of decades, if we can reduce methane emissions, we can have a significant impact on the rate of warming. Mid-century is a very critical time when hopefully the other greenhouse gases will be reduced and will hit peak warming. So it's critical that in the next couple of decades, we get as much methane reduction as possible to reduce it in the atmosphere and reduce that rate of warming. Many models expect an overshoot of the 1.5 or significantly less than 2 degrees. And it's just assumed that the system is going to be able to rebound from that. But there's been some recent public are talking about whether that's really true or not. Is the system as resilient as we're thinking? And so from EDF's perspective, we advocate setting methane targets by the gas itself. And perhaps later down the line, after mid-century, when we can start to get reduction in CO2 in the atmosphere, these exchanges between gases can be something that's more important. But with a goal of reduction, EDF is advocating for using targets set on methane by gas.
Catherine, do you have any opinion about it?
Well, for the frame of the project we are representing today, Re-Livestock, we did a study to define which indicator would we want to use for LCA. And we came to the conclusion that it's a very difficult choice because a life cycle LCA, life cycle assessment, comes with a whole bunch of databases. And we came to the conclusion, given the ongoing debate, we will try to present all gases separately. So we're going to the same direction than Joe, saying we need to have the ability to present those gases in separate ways so that all indicators can be calculated, since the right indicator depends on the question you ask. And I really like this idea of setting targets by gases, and we try to compile to that. Because of the whole databases in the back, it's sometimes just easier to rely on existing standard metrics, which we do, but we also decided to present several of them, not only one, so that its debate can take place. And that's the position we took as a project. We always talk of outcomes. What is the outcome for livestock? And there, the organic sector has a bit its own vision, thinking, well, on the one hand, livestock is essential to some of these systems to help closing cycles. On the other hand, livestock is also a polluter when you have too many of those. Is now the question of greenhouse gas and how many degrees actually the right question that livestock should answer, or shouldn't we actually use totally different targets or our outcomes, or how would you say, other criterias to decide how much livestock is essential? And in that perspective, we would then much more talk of nitrogen disbalances and claim that maybe addressing the nitrogen problem we have in the Western world is at the same time also helping to sort the climate problem, or setting those targets for climate.
Thanks, Catherine. Agustin, do you have any input on these questions? Do you have any comment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, being the last one, I mean, I have been reduced the chances to say something very different, but I mean, it's great. I mean, we have a lot of, I think we agree in most of the ideas in the sense that I think it's important the most important message is reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible and as urgently. This is a must. And I also agree with Michelle, and I think in general that we don't need metrics for that. We need to, of course, we need to know what should be the target of methane in this sense, and then for that we need the policy advice and we need the policy interaction. I mean, and the question in relation with agriculture is about how much we can reduce without jeopardizing, for example, I think probably it's obvious, but I think it needs to be said again, we cannot jeopardize either livelihoods, or we can at least take that into consideration as much as possible to not jeopardize as much economically and socially, and especially when we are talking about the global scale, or even sometimes even in developed countries, more developed countries, well, we need to think in terms of not affecting massively the nutrition, the proper nutrition. So that's if we are talking about human diets. So I think some of the potential challenges that would arise, especially, we'll come up with strategies that when we are focusing on reducing some activity, or we are doing some changes in one activity that reduce one type of gas, for example, a long-lived gas, this intervention leads to increasing other type of gas, which is short term. So it's a trade-off. Okay. So like an example, I'm trying to accelerate the reduction in methane emissions as a strategy to kind of delay all of the strategies that we need to do to reduce CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. I think this is an important place that we need to look at how we do that and what are the repercussions. And about what metric to use, I mean, I think that has been said as well. It has to be linked with the objectives, and whatever has to do with warming, additional warming, etc. So for methane, GWP Star seems to do a better job, like it has been said by Michelle, in remaining carbon budgets exercises as well. When you try to combine methane and CO2 remaining budget, well, it's been already proved. So for example, for carbon footprinting, I see this is more challenging to apply some kind of like a metrics like GWP Star that involved setting like initial consideration of what is the initial emission level to actually understand what is the warming from that initial level. But it depends very much from this initial level. If we start from a very high initial level, well, it's telling you that it's not warming as much as it used to warm in 10 years ago, but that is not really been as helpful maybe if you compare this farm or this milk that comes from this farm, from the carbon footprinting, that if you compare it to another one that has started from a very low level of emissions in 10 years ago. I don't know if so. That's kind of some of my points that I wanted to share. Yeah.
Thank you, Agustin.
Can I know that I obviously had a lot of time before, but
no, go ahead. I forgot to ask you too. You talk.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would really agree with what everyone has said. And I think it's interesting that we're all I think everyone's in agreement that thinking about what you really want to achieve doesn't need a metric. If you want to focus on methane, have a target for methane, and actually that you don't necessarily need a metric in there. When it comes to doing reporting, etc., we're UNFCCC, the UN mandates using GWP 100, but I think that doesn't mean that should be necessarily pushing your direction. You just look at the methane, you look at what you think you can achieve, and that's actually quite independent of a metric. And so I think defining targets separately is a great idea, and I think we're all in agreement on that. And I thought it was also interesting, Catherine, you mentioned like multi-criteria kind of decision making, because obviously greenhouse gas emissions are not the only thing that are important to people. So I think that really comes into play a lot when it comes to the food system, because obviously food is an essential part of life. So that's a whole that would be a very interesting seminar too, to be looking at how you make these kind of assessments on multiple different criteria. And then I'll just say, although Andreas, you summarized what I said as metrics aren't important. Unfortunately, they can be important, but if they're applied badly and we end up with going down the wrong road by accident because we've used a metric rather poorly. So thank you.
Well, just they are important, but not for the which one we decide to use is not important. This was my message. Sorry if I confuse anyone. So all of you seems to agree that the focus should be on emission target for different gases. And well, one of the questions that Michelle raised was, how do we decide what is an acceptable level of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, which is the key question, I think. So Agustin, so you do not complain the next time. I will begin with you. Do you have any any opinion about it?
Well, I think I've kind of already said it more or less because I think, well, I mean, in my opinion, obviously well, it should be taken into account the implications of I mean, we have to, I mean, because we have been with the basics, we also need to also mention that if we think about methane from agriculture, this is a process that well, it's difficult to reduce, but it's almost impossible to put to zero. You know, it's a natural process. It's how cellulose gets degraded. So as long as we have cellulose, so we can have some levels of reduction, but for feeding the population, well, there's going to be a limit. So taking into account this limit, which is the of the process, and then taking into account the limits that will be taken in terms of nutrition, especially, and then taking into account what are the implications of if we make reductions in activity that has to do with livestock or rice, what are the implications for livelihoods? So that's I think for that is more of a political question than a question to me, because otherwise, I mean, it would be very easy to say, well, we just don't eat anything, and then we won't have emissions from that.
I'd like to jump in.
Go ahead, Joe.
So one of the strategies that EDF is using, especially in low and middle income countries, is sustainable development. So trying to work on the methane intensity of food products. And in low and middle income countries, the diets for livestock are not optimal. So improving the diets can reduce the methane intensity, increase productivity, increase the revenue, increase the benefit to the people who are living in that area, but also reduce the intensity of the methane from that product. In addition to diets, animal health is a big issue in a number of countries. Reproductive success is also very important. So this idea of sustainable development can really have multiple wins in that you can reduce the intensity of the product and provide benefits to the people who are raising those animals.
Thank you, Joy. Catherine, Michelle, any comment on this question on how do we decide what is an acceptable level of greenhouse gases from livestock?
Well, I come back to my claim before. I think when I look at the global methane budgets, I try to understand how this whole methane comes and goes. Well, our Earth has a capacity to naturally disintegrate some of this methane, and this is why it disappears in 12 years. And there's two streams of methane that are made by humans that enter that system. One is a fossil one coming from the past, and there is a biogenic one. That's the one that from the plants, the cow emit methane, and they eat plants, and they go back into that atmosphere. And when you look at the total budget, we are producing more methane than the planet can actually absorb. So we have a massive, massive issue, and we need to sort it. So don't get me wrong, but in principle, there's two types of methane. There's this biogenic one and a non-biogenic one. And if we wouldn't have the fossil methane, we somehow could maintain the current population if you do a very quick back of the livestock population, if you would make a back of the envelope calculation. We have all heard what is the benefit of reducing methane from animals, so from methane. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should maintain the current animal numbers, but what it tells us, maybe it's not the best criteria. And I'm back to Well, the outcome we want to achieve is a sustainable livestock system, and that livestock system can admit, because it's part of a biogenic cycle, but we need to find the right way to understand what is a sustainable, or what is a livestock within planetary boundaries. And that really would mean that we have resources that we can use that are not used otherwise in the food system to feed our animals, and that's a number of animals we can keep and probably the environment can maintain. And that criteria is for me the outcome we should go towards, is a criteria of how much livestock can we keep for the ecosystems in general, so that it is good within the carrying capacity of ecosystems. And if you take that argument as an argument to how much should we limit the livestock, then I really think remaining within a closed nitrogen cycle is a much better criteria. And if you use that criteria, then it would mean for most of the Western world a reduction of animal population, which would also lead to a decrease of methane. And I think that would be an interesting way to think about a reduction of livestock, but not per se for the whole ecosystems in general, because sorting a nitrogen problem will help you sort a climate problem and probably a biodiversity problem. And so as much as these CO2 metrics are important, I think they are not the right ones to help us understand how we should keep livestock in future in a sustainable manner.
Yeah,
Michelle?
I think that's I really like that framing, and I think it just kind of goes to show that how narrow, greenhouse gas emissions are in terms of these kind of systems. So it's very important. We want to reduce methane emissions as much as we can, but we've got a whole load of other requirements as well for the system. So having a more holistic approach to understanding the way forward, I think, is, while very tricky, is a very good one and the right approach. And it's when you focus solely on greenhouse gas emissions, you do get different routes to a greener future. So it might be much more intensive systems that actually have a better like a lower emissions intensity per food product, but they might have some other consequences. Whereas if you go for a more organic or agroecological system, you end up having more emissions over the life cycle of the food production, but there's other benefits to it. So it gets very, very complicated. So I don't suppose anybody's got a succinct and easy answer to this, but I guess the bottom line is that it's very complex, and so deciding how much emissions we're going to allocate to any particular sector, it's a very multifaceted kind of process. So I presume there'll be sort of iteration towards something better as time goes on through various different mechanisms, I would hope.
The projections are that the demand for livestock products is going to increase over the next couple of decades as population increases and the level of wealth increases in low and middle income countries. And so going back to the idea of increasing the productivity of those animals is really critical to supplying that increasing demand without having to increase the livestock or increase the livestock herd. And so that's a real part as well. And with regard to nitrogen, I totally agree. Nitrogen and nitrous oxide are very key components to agriculture. And I'll point out that methane control and nitrous oxide control are linked in how the manures are used and through digestion and other ways that can, if done effectively, reduce the amount of inorganic fertilizers that are needed and better create the circularity. Uses the manure nitrogen more effectively.
Can I jump in? I think,
Sure.
Joe, I I understand your position on improving diets in low and middle income countries is probably a really important levy in the system. On the other hand, when you then look at Europe, where we feed these animals so much food that is in competition with human nutrition, there we can still gain from a methane perspective, but we are using more and more land for the total land system because it's so much more inefficient to first feed an animal that takes resources from abroad to then produce food. And therefore, there's also this thinking of, well, maybe a less efficient animal, one that produces more methane per cow, but having less of them, using only the resources that humans cannot consume, meaning grass is something that, at least in Europe we have quite a bit, or byproducts is something that could actually optimize the efficiency of the whole food system as a whole, but not per se per cow. And that probably leads us to the next question on how should policy pay, or how can we get the incentives right. If we get it on an animal base, then there will be an incentive to feed animals, let me quote, better feeds. I wouldn't say that myself from the organic, but more feeds that produce less methane. And therefore would penalize actually those systems that keep the animal numbers within carrying capacity, but actually feed those grasses that emit, that will lead to more methane. And maybe that's just to open the debate. For the next question is I find it quite problematic when the incentives are then going to animal based, just because it might have this feedback in the food system that worries me, which obviously doesn't per se apply for the low and middle income countries.
Yeah, if I may say something, I mean, I would say that I fully agree with what Catherine has mentioned, and I really, I mean, this has been already examples of programs trying to intensify some production systems. For example, in Africa, dairy systems, and this has implied like bringing breeds that require like a much better feed. First, this feed, okay, at the beginning of the program, it was part of the program to give them this feed, but then after the program stopped, this feed obviously was not available because, well, these countries don't have the money to buy it in the global market, plus they don't have their own resources. Plus, we have to also mention that all of this intensification a lot of times comes with an increase, like when we shift from very extensive systems that rely on marginal land, for example, to systems that are more intensified. They rely more or actually they start to rely on fossil fuels by like indirectly from the energy all of this system requires. So we have to be, and this is kind of a perfect example where the metrics like of comparing CO2 and methane counts, because then you are bringing in much more CO2 from fossil fuel. You are reducing entering methane and even other type of methane, but then you have to figure out just only for the climate impact perspective whether this is counterproductive or not. It's a double-edged sword sometimes.
Any other comment from the panelists? Michelle, Joe? Everything is done. So, well, you already began to do it, but I have to officially begin the discussion. Assuming that your government want to reduce emissions, which depends a lot on the ideology of the government in which you're living, what is the intended outcome that we need to use to how do we incentivize this in terms of policy? How do we do it? Michelle, do you want to begin the discussion on your own question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good, I feel like it's a good question that I don't necessarily have an answer for. But I think it's just good to be talking about these things explicitly and be able to understand and be transparent about targets, about incentives, etc. Because that's just transparency is one of the foundations of a good functioning democracy. So being able to understand what the aim is, what the objective is, so we can criticize and evaluate ourselves, what we think is going on, if we think it's not fit for purpose. I think that's essential, really. So I don't know at present if I have much more to add on this, but I just think it's a very interesting thing to discuss.
I'll be happy to jump in. Andres, you're muted, but government action is very different in different parts of the world. That's the first thing to underline. In the US, the government is very hesitant to regulate agriculture. In Europe, government is more ready to regulate agriculture, but is dealing with the nitrate directive and complicates the issues with methane. In India, where we work a lot, the government is very focused on sustainable development and doesn't like to talk about methane from livestock animals. And the nutritional needs there are much more a part of the dairy system. And so each of those requires different approaches. PDF has chosen to work with corporations a lot because they have a lot of power to make changes, to provide incentives to the producers, especially in the U.S. and Western countries. In India, the idea of increasing productivity is key, and linking, and as I said earlier, linking that to methane intensity, trying to improve the livelihoods of people while reducing the climate impact. So there's many different approaches, and I don't think you can put it all in one type of approach.
Catherine?
Well, I think I've said again with a European perspective that I am worried about incentives that would be linked to a single animal or to a single farm because of this fear that optimizing methane competes directly with an optimal food system, as you need to start feeding more efficiently your animal, and therefore you're going to be leading to probably feeding even more concentrates than today, leaving a resource that grass basically that is otherwise not used. And we're really trying to find this idea that every animal needs to be methane the most efficient possible as an animal, but the whole system in which that animal is in should be efficient. And therefore we really like the idea of that the organic has is limiting the animal numbers to what is part of the carrying capacity of the animal, the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, rather than working on animals and farms.
Agustin, any comment? You're last, so.
Okay. Well, I mean, just to make the point, to stress the point that yeah, it's been said, but I mean, it's very different, the policy that is expected to, even how it's going to be applied, like Joy already mentioned, in the US differently from Europe, but also like depending on the level of development or of the situation of your country, I think the policy needs to be differently applied and the focus needs to be differently put. So for example, I mean, there are going to be countries where, I mean, we haven't said that, but I mean, implicitly in our, I suppose, in our arguments that the policy, the climate policy needs to take into account not only mitigation, but also the adaptation aspects of climate change. So some countries are going to be severely affected by climate change, or are already affected and are more vulnerable. So I think at least this needs to be recognized that all of these mitigation targets or this mitigation policy, for these type of countries, especially those that are farther from being fully developed, need to reconcile very seriously the adaptation problems and the problems that they may have with food security. So the prioritization, I feel sometimes, maybe because I'm working more on this field of climate change mitigation, but I feel that it's not fair to be putting as much emphasis as on the other side of the story of climate change for these particular countries, of course. And obviously for these particular countries, I suppose that the Paris Agreement was trying to bring all of this help from the richer countries to these kind of countries for both adaptation and also mitigation. But like my emphasis here would be like just careful with the not reconciling the most important targets for some of these countries that need to be on adaptation and resilience for climate change impacts.
Thank you, Agustin. So before I go into the no, I will go into the questions from the people. Many of them are not questions, are comments. So I will just go to the question. Well, one of the ones that I like the most is from Gabriel Dreyfus, and I think it's for you, Michelle. It's mostly related with how you use the GWP start. I will read the question, but if you can read it in the question and because it's a long question with a lot of dates and so on, so it's better you read it. So the question from Gabriel Dreyfus: does a GWP star require choosing a baseline year for assessing impact of change in emission relative to temperature impact? Yeah, so she's asking if I use one date to begin the measurement or another date, the output will be different, basically. You can read all of you can read the question from Gabriel in the question and ask section. Michelle, do you have any answer for that?
Yeah, so I didn't go into how GWP star works or the equation or anything, but yes, you have you will always need at least two data points, so at least 2 times, because you're looking at changes in emissions over time. So we're approximating the trend in methane emissions if we're using GWP star to look at methane emissions. So in that sense, that could be determined as the baseline year. I'm not sure. So Gabrielle has mentioned a baseline year. So what you so there could be different ways of interpreting what the baseline would be. So if you're doing a whole time series where you have emissions for a country over many decades, the baseline, I suppose, would be where you start that emissions inventory from. And so you can use GWP star to look at the amount of warming relative to that baseline year. So you could do it, and in her example, she has 1850 to 1900 as a baseline. So you could, and we've done this. This is what's so where GWP star is in the last IPCC assessment report. Didn't include the figure in my talk because it's a bit complicated, but basically it takes emissions from that period, so a pre-industrial type period, and it looks at basically emissions and warming over the whole period from pre-industrial to present day. So you can do that, and you're seeing how much warming methane has generated over that whole time period. If you take, say, 1990 or 2000 as a baseline year, that will show something that looks quite different, even if it's the same data, because if we've, let's say in a country that we've peaked our methane emissions and then we're declining them, obviously we'll have the temperature, the contribution to global warming will also have peaked and declined. So if we've reduced our emissions since 1980, let's say, and we're looking at it the warming relative to 1980, we'll have quite a different picture because it's just showing the last bit of the graph instead of the beginning as well. So yeah, so you can, in the same way that you can show emissions over any time period. You could use GWP star over any time period, really, that shows this baseline, and that's where a little bit of understanding is helpful to understand what you're looking at, because I guess it could be a bit not non-intuitive perhaps, if you've never seen this before, and it's relative to 1980 or something like that. I'm not sure if I completely answered the question, but I talked about it a little bit. Hopefully that's okay. I don't know if someone else might have also a thought on it if they've read the question and have taken a different interpretation of it than me.
Anyone has a different interpretation of the question? Someone else read the question? It's about using different starting points from using EWP start. Anyone has an input on it besides Michelle? The question from Gabriel Dreyfus. Also to the people I'm seeing coming in the chat that, well, the question was really long, so I didn't read it completely, and people in the chat is complaining where to watch the question. Well, I don't know if all of you in the toolbar of Zoom, if you go down, there is a box called questions and answers. If you click there, you should read the question. Okay. If you cannot see it, I don't know what you see, but if you cannot see it, please let me know so I can paste the question in the chat. Okay, there are more comments. Okay. A question from Jerry Lawson. The argument is often used that intensive livestock emit less methane per kilogram of meat or milk than extensive livestock. Does life cycle analysis of all inputs allow a more complete comparison between intensive and extensive? I mean, this is not part of the debate, but yeah, I know that people here work in life cycle assessment. Do you have any?
Well, I guess
comment?
the question was for me. Well, I mean, the question is worth a whole own webinar. And I tried to be very simple. It has to do with what's called functional unit. As long as we are trying to say how much methane per product, extensive systems who need more inputs to achieve the same product will look less good. That is almost always the case. There's a very nice paper in Nature published to show that comparing organic, non-organic, and except for milk, it's almost always the case. But the real question is it doesn't say how much, whether that product, which is produced efficiently, is produced within the natural resource base from that location. And therefore, maybe it's also just the wrong metrics to assess that. And one other way to look at it, or you can use life cycle assessment, is to actually express it per hectare of agricultural land, and then extensive systems are always performing much better. So again, here it's also a metrics question, and again, which metrics do you use? Is to answer which question. And the current trend is per product, and therefore, if that is the metrics used, then intensive tends to look better than extensive systems. And here again, I would claim using a different metrics, but it will be an own seminar on its own on metrics again.
We can organize more webinars. Don't worry, in the future. Okay, there is another question for you, Catherine. I think that you is the question before the last in the question and ask section.
Well, yes.
Yeah, I will read it, and I will paste it in the chat so everyone can see it. When we design livestock investment projects in his institution, we often promote intensive, semi-intensive system because they need to increase animal protein source production for food and nutrition security and also technically better breed feed results in lower greenhouse gas emission. This we think is the more sustainable way of increasing production, similar of what Joe mentioned earlier. What do Catherine has to say about this, and what sort of better feed can we develop to increase livestock production in his institution, which is LMACS?
That's low and middle income countries.
Oh, sorry. Sorry for my ignorance in
this is
general
a
abbreviations.
really good question. And again, I think coming from the organic sector, I really think for Africa, there's a lot of agroecological solution, meaning improving the crop production within the boundaries with legumes, so combining they sometimes also have these terraces where they can plant feed on places to stabilize. So there's really to stabilize the whole slope. And therefore there's many things you can do in African countries to improve the availability of feed and food at the same time through agroecological solutions. And in that perspective, when you start going to African countries, I wouldn't say just look at improving crops, but always look at improving the crops and the fodder at the same time, and just increase as much as possible the biomass production in a sustainable way. And that biomass that cannot be eaten by humans, give it to the animals. And it seems, and I haven't worked on that for the last 5 or 6 years, but when I used to be working in those topics, that the yield gap was still so big that there would really be potential to increase both the crop, the biomass, and therefore the livestock feed without falling in that trap of taking food away that people could use directly and then give it to animals. This problem is even more problematic in Africa, where people are really suffering from hunger. So if you take their maize away to then give it to livestock, and then you feed less people on livestock, on what, I don't know, chicken meat, because you took the maize away from the poorest people, then it's a real problem. So there you really need to look for solutions that increase biomass availability both for humans and animals. And that, in my perspective, answers will be found in agroecological solutions. I hope that this was a good answer.
Agustin, you say that you want to answer the question from Gabriel about different dates. I mean, is he in the question?
I already answered in the chat, so it could go to another thing. It was just a direct reply, so I think it's fine. Anyone can read it, my reply.
Okay, good.
You're muted, so we don't hear you.
Later, there is a question from Maria, which is super specific about fires, and all the other ones are more comments than questions. About well, I was reading a question in the chat that I shouldn't do it, but yeah, a comment on because one of the critics that GWP start in relation with other metrics is that a little bit more complex to calculate. So could you point out on a little bit on the positive on negatives on GWP star and on other metrics compared with the standard, for instance?
Yeah, so the standard metric GWP 100, it's just a single number, and in fact, most of the metrics like global temperature change potential, they're normally one single number. So it's just a value of 29 or 84 or whatever it is. So you just multiply your methane emissions by a single number. And because we've seen how methane over time behaves differently compared to CO2, you can see how any metric that is just a single number is not going to capture all of that time development over time. So the advantage, one clear advantage of a simple metric is it's just one number and anyone can basically multiply a methane emission by a single number. So over time, there's been different metrics or different ways of applying them that make it a bit more specific to the question. So you might say you're interested in temperature in 2050, you might use GTP, global temperature change potential, with the number of years between now and then. So every year you decrease by 1. So in 2025 you're using GTP 25, and next year you'll use GTP 24, or there's different metrics that use are designed for pulse emissions, and some that are designed for sustained emissions, and so there's all sorts of different ones that have developed to try and be simple for the case in hand. So I guess then you have a multitude of different metrics to pick from, which is really confusing, even if each individual one is simple to use. So the thinking behind metrics like GWP star and combined global temperature change potential is that we want one that's quite simple to use and universal. So you don't need to pick and choose a different metric for every different situation. And as a consequence, though, there's some slight more complexity to it. So the way that GWP star works, we have 2 terms instead of 1 term. So effectively, the first term is a bit like using a GWP 20, but it's applied to so it's a big number, but it's applied to a change in emissions. So it's applied to, is your methane emission increasing or decreasing at this particular time? And then there's a much smaller term, which is the longer term effect, which is much smaller than GWP 100, but that is applied for that longer term effect. So we have kind of 2 parts to the equation. And because you're looking at a trend, so this is trying to capture what happens in our climate models and in the actual climate system, is when we were talking about the making an emission into the atmosphere of methane, if we kept a steady emission, we'd basically end up with a dynamic equilibrium where the emissions are being balanced by the chemical reactions, and we wouldn't be increasing the amount of methane left in the atmosphere. So we need a trend in here to capture whether that amount of methane in the atmosphere is going up if we have increasing emissions, or if it's going down if we have decreasing emissions, or if it's staying about the same if we have stable emissions. And so that's why we need at least 2 kind of years of emissions. So the way that we do it as standard would be to say, what was the methane emission 20 years ago, and what is it now? And so what is that trend? And we're essentially looking at a trend between 2 years. There's other ways you could do it potentially, but we've done it like this. And so 20 years ago to today, that kind of captures the timescale that methane is in the atmosphere for. So it's a representative timescale of methane in the atmosphere. And so it does require you to frame your question quite well. So at a global level, this might be quite easy because we have emissions data sets from around the world. And at a country level, it might be quite easy because we have country level emissions data sets. So we can look at, what's going on with the methane emissions at a country level. It is more complicated to look at it at a smaller scale, because then you have questions of, what data do I have? Do I know what was going on? How do I, if you're looking at if you start looking at a farm level, you have to be careful that you're defining what you're representing very carefully, so that you're doing something sensible that and you're interpreting it correctly. So I think as you get to smaller scales, and I think there may have been a comment about this in the chat, it's hard to follow them all. It's important to really, I think carefully about how you're applying it. So I do see that there is a bit more, I suppose care does need to be paid to how you use it, so that you don't misuse it. I would say that's the same for any metric really, and we don't normally spend a lot of we don't always spend a lot of attention carefully picking every other metric, because if it's easy to use, you can just use it just like that for any old purpose, without thinking twice about it. So in a sense, it's not that different from any other metric, which you should ideally be understanding before you're using it as well.
I wanted to sort of follow up with a comment. One of the outcomes of GDP star is since it's looking at a trend over time, is that if emissions remain constant, there's no net warming, and but there's still the continued warming that's happening from that methane itself. And some people have taken the no net warming result from GDP star as the target. No net warming is the appropriate target for CO2, but it is not for methane because of the opportunity that occurs when you reduce the methane, you reduce the atmospheric concentration. Actually, for CO2, eventually the goal is to get reduction in emissions. No net warming is the first target, but then Paris Agreement says and then go beyond. And so I just wanted to point out, some have noted that high emitters that don't increase emissions shouldn't consider that as no net warming as the proper goal. Where others that are emitting at low levels and increase are seen as more problematic.
Yeah, there is there's a graph in the FAO report which tries to bring this out, which is it's from a paper by Andy Reisinger and possibly others, but it shows this kind of concept that if you have if you're sort of staying at the no net warming, if you're not changing the level of warming, you're propping it up, you're maintaining it at its past level. So we've raised, if I'm a country, I've got methane emissions today that are a certain level. If I continue emitting, I'm maintaining this contribution to global warming at the current level. We're propping it up. So obviously reducing them, you can reduce your impact on global warming levels. And so there's a diagram which is a little bit complicated, but it does sort of factor in those different elements of the system.
So to finish the discussion, one last comment in the question. I will read the last question and I will paste it in the chat now. Question from Hayden. Michelle mentioned that GWP star could allow for incentivize for not additional warming. Incentivizing no warming will be like paying someone to do nothing new and additional, just maintaining the status quo of methane emissions. Might that lead to suboptimal outcomes if those actors who could do something have little or no intention to do so because we're basically grandparenting historical emission levels? Comment, question.
Yeah, did I say that? I don't know if I don't even remember saying that. But it could, yes, it could in theory. So it depends what you want to incentivize. So this is incentivized. So this is my point really, that governments should decide what is it that they want. What's the outcome that they want? And then figure out how to incentivize that. So if their ambition is to halve methane emissions by 2050, they can look at incentivizing that based on either just, do you assign a value to a methane emission that you've reduced, and how do you assign that value? Do you do it by looking at the benefits that you get from reducing levels of global warming from your country, or do you do it some other way? I mean, it's really up to I think targets need to be set with a really clear idea of what do governments really want? What are they, that we have the Paris Agreement, governments have agreed to attempt, do their best to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, make efforts towards 1.5 degrees. How they do that is, I mean, it is up to them for them to develop their ways forward for doing that. And So using whatever tools they have available, so within the Paris Agreement, they can use different metrics, they can use different models to be trying to figure out what it is that they think they can do, what targets are appropriate for them to have this highest level of ambition. And so yeah, it may be that so I just think that having I would agree that simply saying that no more warming, that doesn't sound like the greatest of ambition, but it would depend on the country, I suppose. Maybe in some countries that would actually be quite a good outcome. Other countries, you'd want to reduce emissions. Some countries are likely to want to increase methane emissions, and so this all needs to add up together to not exceed the 2-degree temperature threshold.
I'll just make a quick comment that obviously Global Methane Pledge signed by 159 countries sets a reduction target of 30% reduction from 2020 levels by 2030. So some governments have put a goal out there.
So with that question from Hayden, we just finished the webinar. I don't know if any of the panelists want to make a final statement to conclude or comment that a point that we didn't touch or anything extra you want to say?
I would like to make a plug for EDF's Methane Sat satellite we launched last spring, and it's measuring emissions now. It's focused largely on oil and gas infrastructure, but it is measuring agriculture, and it's a unique satellite in that it measures large and very small emissions. We are still trying to figure out what it can do for agriculture. Preliminary results are very promising, but keep an eye out for it. Once we get the data processing working quickly, we'll be releasing data for everyone to use. methanesat.org.
Thank you very much. Maybe you want to share with us the link in the chat or something?
Yes, methanesat.org. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, so everyone can see it. And that's it. There are a lot of questions asking if this is going to be published later. Well, I will ask later to the panelists if they agree that I publish this, and if they agree, I will publish if their information. So I need their permission for publishing. So having said that, Michelle, Agustin, Catherine, Joe, thank you very much for contributing for this dissemination activity, and well, keep in touch. If you want to do anything else in the future, just keep in touch. To all the people, thank you very much for your questions, inputs, and well, any comments. I will try to have this published, and well, any question, just contact me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Andres. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for the great
Thank you.
discussion.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.